So hopefully you've read the Nasser article. It's a chapter or an essay from a book of essays by Sayyid Hussein Nasser, and he's addressing the relation of Islam to the modern world in some ways, to our modern way of thinking. And he's contrasting it, and some key things to understand. If you haven't read it, this may help you understand it better. If you've read it, maybe it'll help you understand what you've already read, or maybe you can go back and kind of look at some things, especially as I pull out some quotes in this lecture. But he's looking at the difference between the sacred and the secular, and he's making the case that for the Muslim, there really isn't a division. In fact, the sacred secular division historically comes from Christianity. Now, it doesn't mean in the historical Christian context what it necessarily means today. For Islam, the idea that Nasser is saying is that nothing is secular. Religion must play into every aspect of life. So, how you wash your hands, what food you eat, who can drive a car, how tall you can build your buildings, right? Because it's not just about rules. Those mention rules, right? Those are questions of commands and rules, but they're ways of life. They reflect on your understanding of reality. So, for instance, the how tall you can build your house is related to a value for the privacy of your neighbor, right? You shouldn't be able to build a building so tall that you can look over your neighbor's wall and see his wife or daughters. But everything for the Muslim, in some sense, is to be sacred. Now, I said that what Nasser and others, even a lot of modern people, take the division of sacred and secular to mean is not quite an accurate understanding of the historical context within the Christian community and history, right? So, sacred and secular in the Christian context had to do with ministry positions. If your position was as a monk or a nun, then you had a sacred office. You were totally devoted to prayer and nothing else. That was a sort of a special place. But that doesn't mean that other things and other people shouldn't be devoted to God completely. It's sort of a special designation of devotion. And a secular was a priest who is meant to minister to and lead the average regular people in worship of God and in living their life in a way that honors God. So it's not a stark division like we see in the modern world when those terms are first kind of coined. The terms have to do with a breaking off of a special order to devote themselves completely to prayer. That would be the sacred, the monk, right? The monastic. So that's one of the things that Nasser is trying to flesh out, because our kind of Western European American culture is strongly impacted by the idea of a secular segment of the world. And Nasser is arguing that Islam doesn't have that distinction or that division. And that goes on to this idea of unity and division, right? That's a key part of what he's discussing. The reason they don't have this idea of sacred or secular is because the focus is on unity. When I talk about Islam, oftentimes I'll talk about the onlyness of God, and I might mention that a little more in a following slide. But it's not just the oneness of God. Christians believe in one God. Some Hindus believe in one God in spite of all the many manifestations. They believe that they're all manifestations of one God. They're just embodiments of different attributes of the God. Now, that's not most Hindus, but it is some, especially more highly educated Hindus from that are more kind of in relation to, and there were some Hindu reformers who moved towards a sort of monotheism where the myths and the gods and the shrines and the idols, they all just manifest different attributes of the one reality. So unity being the case, but what what Islam means in unity, actually, as Nasser explains it, relates more closely to a Hindu version of unity than to a Christian version of unity versus division. So there is plurality in the unity of Christianity. There's this idea of three persons, one God. Islam is about the onlyness of God. God is the only really truly existent thing, and the manifestations don't really matter. So he also delves into this question of reality versus illusion. What is really real and what is not? And for Nasser, only God is really real. Everything else is merely illusion. And here again, Nasser's discussion of Islam resonates with certain expressions of Hinduism. I'm not saying every Muslim would explain it that way. There are Muslims who think that Nasser is somewhat heretical, but he is widely respected among Sufi and Shia communities of Islam. And some Sunnis respect Nasser tremendously for his writing and thinking. So this is always the challenge when reading a theologian within a religion or school of thought. But Nasser is making the point, right, that Westerners often want Muslims to dismiss the idea of Sharia, the law of God, affecting day in and day out life in society. And Nasser saying that's impossible. You can't do away with that because God is at the center, at the heart of everything. And so it's his commands that matter. Now, I talked about, when I was talking about Euthyphro and the question of divine command versus other religious approaches to morality. And I had mentioned that Islam is probably the most fully and generally embracing of a sort of divine command, because God is power, God is all power. Whatever God says goes. So, in this context, I did mention that all the major world religions do have a sort of wisdom, virtue tradition, at least within the bounds of the broader religion, and they all have some sense of what is the overarching reality. So we talk about Dharma or the Tao, wisdom, Sophia in Greek. I can't remember the Hebrew word, but Logos, the word, the reason. And for Islam, the overarching reality is al-Din, the religion. Muslims believe that that Muhammad is teaching a restoration of the religion of Abraham. That Jews are a descendant of Abraham, but they got the religion wrong. That Christians, the prophet Jesus, they see Jesus as a prophet, is a prophet, and he's good, but he's not God. And so Christians, say Muslims, have rejected the religion of Abraham because Abraham is fully monotheistic as Muslims understand him in the Muslim understanding of monotheism. But that said, they all have this sense of this overarching reality. The Dharma in Hinduism and Jainism, this is the way the world is. It's to some degree in Buddhism as well. In Buddhism, it's manifested in the teachings of the Buddha, which is Dharma. Tao, the way, the Tao in Taoism, right? The wisdom of the prophets, or the wisdom of Proverbs and Psalms, the Job in the Bible, in the Hebrew Scriptures, right, in the Bible. The Logos, Christianity talks about in the beginning was the Word. So this is the idea of there's an overarching reality, and it impacts every aspect of human life and living, and the idea of an order to the world, right? So this is what I said is kind of in contention, or at least alleviates some of the problems of divine command, but in different ways in the different contexts, right? I don't want you to assume because there is an overarching reality and there are similarities, right? We talked about some of the similarities between the overarching realities, similarities between the religions and Socrates, right? This idea of temperance, of order, right? But oftentimes, people look at the religions, they say, oh, they have this overarching reality, they have these similarities of of rules and ideas. So all roads basically lead up the mountain. Um, but that's that's this kind of modern tendency to say, well, all religions are basically the same thing, and I don't think that's a fair approach. Um, any more fair than trying to attack them with the Euthyphro dilemma, as if a modern world religion is expressing the same things necessarily that Euthyphro is expressing as a pagan who believes in multiple gods who disagree and fight with each other and aren't much more than glorified humans, um, with all the vices of humanity. Right? That's Euthyphro's idea. He takes the mythology, and I said that's really when Socrates' critique of Euthyphro's religion and the popular religion of Athens, it doesn't exactly apply to the major world religions as they're often expressed in the modern context. But that doesn't mean they're all the same, and you can't simply say what is all roads lead up the mountain. You have to ask what is the mountain. If you say all roads lead up the mountain, you're saying I know what the mountain is, and they all get to the same place, right? You're claiming a certain type of knowledge beyond what the various expressions and manifestations claim, and that's a bold, maybe arrogant stance, right? In fact, I would say there's a story of um, this king in India who, you know, he's listening to different people argue about religion, and he says, I want to show you what religion is like, what it is to argue about religion. And he brings in an elephant, and he brings in 5 blind men. And the blind men are set at different places along the elephant, and each one grabs or touches a different part of the elephant. One of them leans against the side and says, "Oh, an elephant's like a house," and another one is down by the leg and kind of reaches his arm around it and says, "Oh no, not a house. An elephant's like a tree." One happens to get hold of a tail and say, "No, no, the elephant is like the tail is like a rope. The elephant's like a rope. This feels like a rope." And then another one grabs the trunk and says, "No, elephants are like a snake." Um, And the king says, "See, that's what all the religions, they're all one thing. It's just people get different parts of them." But there again, if you're going to say that, you are claiming, the question to ask yourself is, where are you observing this story? Where's your position? And you're putting yourself in the place of the king who sees the whole thing as the critic of the blind men. So what you're essentially saying, and this is what moderns tend to do with religious people, right, is, oh, we're modern, we're advanced, we're new, we know all this stuff, so we know which ones of you are seeing, so we can pick out what parts of every religion are true. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to understand truth, we shouldn't take people seriously, we shouldn't think critically. But I'm saying we should be very careful of assuming everybody's seeing the same thing or saying the same thing or feeling the same thing and just calling it different parts, or they get a part of it but not all of it, and we have an understanding of all of it. That can be a sort of a tendency towards arrogance. So when I want to talk, I do want to talk about similarities in religion and differences. I don't want to come across as saying that all religions are exactly the same. They're not. They're clearly not. Um, but they all are asking questions about what is real, right? And um, this is actually a place where I think you'll find some more similarity between Hinduism and Buddhism, and even Nasser's expression of Islam, though again his expression and his teaching is not accepted by every Muslim out there, but there are a lot who do. But in Hinduism, there's the idea that man cannot see God on account of the barrier of Maya, Maya's illusion. And see if this doesn't resonate with what we saw in Nasser, right? The truth is that God alone is real and all else is unreal. Men, universe, house, children, all these things are like the magic of the magician. The magician strikes his wand and says, "Come delusion, come confusion." Then he says to the audience, "Open the lid of the pot, see the birds fly into the sky." But the magician alone is real, and his magic unreal. The unreal exists for a second and then vanishes. This is a Hindu thinker, Sri Ramakrishna, who's essentially saying everything about the world, even your personality, your language, what you consider yourself as a Western kind of European American influenced person, that thing which you consider yourself, that's an illusion. When Hindus talk about reincarnation, that thing disappears. That's not what is reincarnated. In fact, anything that's left of it into the next life, that's called the jiva, the temporal soul, that's a problem. That's something you should actually be trying to get rid of, according to Hinduism and Buddhism. Um, there's an ultimate reality that's all one thing, and everything else is an illusion, and all the differences and all the diversities, those are illusions. They're not real, and they hold you back from your kind of participation in the one reality. Um, See if that doesn't resonate though with the way Nasser explains Islam, right? He says, in the unitary perspective of Islam, all aspects of life, as well as all degrees of cosmic manifestation, are governed by a single principle and are unified by a common center. There is nothing outside the power of God, and in a more esoteric, like inward, meditative, spiritual sense, nothing outside his being, for there cannot be two orders of reality. La ilaha illallah, that's the Muslim statement that no God but God, means ultimately that there is no being or reality other than the absolute being or the absolute reality. In essence, therefore, everything is sacred and nothing profane, because everything bears within itself the fragrance of the divine. In essence, on some level, Nasser is saying anything that's apart from God, anything that's sinful, broken, ignorant, really anything created is not really fully real. That only God is real, and everything else is almost an illusion. Um, so, and that illusion, he says at the bottom of, he says in page 7 and 8, says, in such a perspective, the meaning of religion and secularism appears in a new light. Religion becomes the revelation sent by God to man to guide him towards unity, to help him become what he always was but has forgotten. That is to make him remember and regain the celestial beatitude which he once enjoyed before falling into the prison of the senses. Okay, remember I said that Al-Din is the religion. And actually the religion for Islam is about remembering. The point of religion is to remember God. So to remember the ultimate reality, to move beyond the illusions, right? So religion may be considered ultimately as the divine guide by the help of which man can overcome the ontological, that's the reality, real barrier separating him from the divine origin. Although in essence he has never been separated from it, right? So here again, Nasser is sounding somewhat Hindu. Like the reality is that all of reality is one reality and everything else is illusion and not real. So if you're not united to God, then you're not real, you don't matter, you're insignificant. If you are loyal to God, then you're moving towards unity through remembrance and the practice of religion. He goes on to say the mystery of creation, this is down near the bottom here, that the lies in the fact that God, despite his perfection and his plenitude, brings into being a world which, although nothing but himself, does not share his perfection. Whereas Nasser is saying the world is, insofar as it is real, is an expression of God, is part of God. This sounds very Hindu. Again, not every Muslim is going to go quite there, but the point is the sort of onlyness of God. It's God alone that matters. Everything else is superfluous. It is this separation which, although an illusion with respect to the divine, in other words, it's not real, nevertheless is quite real with respect to cosmic existence, and which is the source of all secularism, of all that is from the human point of view not sacred or non-divine. In other words, he's saying division and disunity are illusion, and those are the problem. Those are what keep us separate from God. The point of religion is to remind us, to bring us back into union with the unity that is God. So this idea of illusion and gnosis and remembering, these are things that are consistent in some of the major religious traditions. Not only do, to some degree, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and other related um, world religions, other world religions have a similarity of they all have rules, and oftentimes those rules are similar because of what we talked about last time, right? That there are these aspects of human life that are just inescapable, having to do with property, with the integrity of sexual relations, the value of the human person, all these things. And religion has to do with recognizing what is real, what is illusion, gnosis or knowledge, coming to true knowledge of that reality, and remembering who you really are, and not participating in the illusion or being separate, but being united to reality. This is the goal, um, to some degree in Islam, through al-Din, through the religion of remembering, in some sense through Hinduism. Sanatana Dharma is the way things are. Jainism is another religion that's kind of an offshoot of Hinduism. Hinduism in sort of the extreme. Everything is illusion except the one reality. All the gods are just manifestations. The difference between Islam and Hinduism is obviously that Hinduism is focused on the oneness of God. Hinduism is often focused on the myriad of manifestations. Um, Buddhism, interestingly, shares a lot in common with Hinduism. It talks a lot about Dharma, the way the world is. It talks a lot about illusion, that this life is illusory, that you're trying to escape the illusion, but it's not interested in manifestation or creation or really the knowledge of God. In some sense, in Buddhism, God is superfluous. So while there are these similarities having to do with illusion, gnosis, or knowing and remembering, Buddhism has that underpinning. You are living in an illusion. You need to gain true gnosis, true knowledge, mystical knowledge even, so that you can remember the reality of who or what you are and escape this realm of suffering. But while for Islam, the remembering has everything to do with remembering God and his commands, in Hinduism, the remembering has to do with something of remembering and focusing on the reality beyond all the illusions of self. Buddhism rejects the idea of God and the idea of self. Right? So for Islam, God is central. For Hinduism, self is central because self is merely participation in the one reality. You are kind of a capital S self. You're part of the one reality that is self. Buddhism says there is no self, and if there is a God, he doesn't matter. So there's a distinction between these three, in spite of their similarity in approach to reality, that much of reality is illusion that has to be escaped through gnosis, through mystical knowledge, and remembering of who you really are, right? So this idea in Islam, there's nothing outside the power of God. Power of God is essential to understanding Islam. And if you want to understand how the religions differ, in spite of how they're alike, understanding the concept of power is important. But Nasr goes on to say there's nothing outside his being, for there cannot be two orders of reality. Monism, there's only one order of reality that's really real. For Islam, for Hinduism, for Buddhism, there again, between those three, there's differences on how that's expressed, how that's experienced, how that separation from the one reality is overcome. But they all have that idea that only the ultimate is real, and you are to participate in that through some form of remembrance and escape from the illusion. This is why in Islam, divine command theory kind of works, because what is God? God is power. If God the Exalted had informed us that we would be punished for the acts of others or for our own obedience, all that would have been right and just, and we should have been obliged to accept it. Ibn Hazm is the theologian who said this, but this is pretty common understanding of the absolute power, the absolute reality of God, and the fact that everything else is illusory. Everything else is not really real. So no matter what you think you know of God, no matter what you think you know of his commands, no matter what he has revealed in some sense, it's an incomplete revelation because you are an incomplete and an imperfect and an illusory sort of being, or at least trapped in an illusion of existence. And religion is about remembering, but even in your religion, you can be in error, you can be in illusion. The same is true of Hinduism, and to some degree, the same is true of Buddhism. But in Buddhism, it's not about God, and it's not about the self. It's about escape. Um, but here's another commonality: sin and evil, because of this concept of illusion versus reality. Sin and evil don't take a primary place in Islam. Because if God is so powerful that anything he says is automatically good and right, then there is no real evil. Right? You can't have real evil. You can have disobedience, you can have failure to remember. You could make the case, well, God wouldn't do this or that because, well, he is good and he doesn't like those things. But you can't say that God can't do those things, and if God can't do them, and if God did them, they would be good, then you don't really have an evil. You don't have a sin. In Buddhism, there's no sin, there's only forgetfulness. In Islam, the point is that you've forgotten who God is. The point of religion is to remind you of the worship of the true God, of the one God, of the onlyness of God, that there is no to get you away from focus on the variety and plurality of manifestations in the world and focus solely on the oneness of God. Hinduism, there is no sense of sin and evil because everything is illusion. And in the one sense, right, here's if you want to understand how that works. So you have a Brahmin caste, right? The highest caste, and supposedly the highest caste is the place from which one is most likely to be able to achieve union with the ultimate reality, with the cosmos, right, with the order of reality. Um, and yet, there are those who are sort of mystics within Hinduism. So a priestly class, a Brahmin, has to maintain a certain standard of purity. There are things that they don't touch. They don't clean their own bathrooms. They never would butcher meat. They can't, they have cleaning rituals for after they go to the bathroom because they're supposed to be pure, right? They're going to achieve moksha, union with the ultimate of the universe. They're supposed to escape. They're the closest to escaping illusion because of their position in the caste system. And yet you have these sort of mystics who will go sit on a trash heap and cover themselves in dung, and it's taken as an understanding that they have surpassed illusion because they understand that there is no difference between purity and impurity, between evil and good. Everything is just an illusion. So all these world religions, while they have a sense of temperance, a sense of self-control, there are rules that you have to follow, there are standards. At some level, they all say, when it comes to the ultimate, that doesn't really matter. The point is to escape all of that, because all of that, good and evil, sin and righteousness, those are all illusions, and the point is oneness with reality. And reality is not part of this illusion. Reality does not fit in your categories. So that's within Taoism, within Hinduism and Buddhism, right? Swami Sivananda, Sivananda, I mispronounced that. All visible things are Maya. Maya will vanish through the effect of knowledge, jnana. One must strive to get rid of Maya, get rid of illusion, get rid of, Maya being illusion, which devastates the mind. The destruction of the mind means the annihilation of Maya. Meditation is the only way in which to dominate Maya, right? So, within Hinduism, to overcome your human reasoning is the goal. This is why Hindu meditation and the Hindu idea of knowledge, jnana, is not about scientific knowledge or reasoning. It's about escaping reason. The same with Hinduism. If you're familiar at all with especially Zen Buddhism, there are these koans. Koans are these things that, from any kind of normal, sensible understanding of the world, they reject all categories. So a koan is something like, what's the sound of one hand clapping, or this puzzle, supposedly puzzle, but there is no solution in a discursive, reasoned way. Like, so You have a jar with a narrow opening and a wide, fat, broad, like a big cavity underneath. So think of like an hourglass sort of shaped jar, and you stick a baby goose down in it, and you feed it and give it water, and it stays down in there, and then it gets so big that it can't fit out the narrow opening. How do you get the goose out without breaking the jar and without killing the goose or dismembering the goose, right? And then one day, one of the disciples yells and claps and says, "Aha! The goose is out." And that's a koan. It's like, what? And you puzzle over that koan, right? Some will say, "Oh, well, obviously, in and out are just illusions. You are not. You're stuck in the world apart from the the jar, right? I mean, it's it's not about reasoning. It's about um, a direct apprehension of a reality, right? So you're trying to escape illusion. It has nothing to do with sin and evil because sin and evil aren't real, right? That's why God can command anything in Islam. That's why in Hinduism someone can actually achieve moksha through the rejection of caste standards. That's why in Buddhism you have the koans, which is the rejection of reason in some sense. But in spite of all these root similarities, understand that between those major strains of religion, those major traditions, in Islam, there's this idea of the onlyness of God. That's the focus. God is one. He is the one and only. In fact, the worst sin in Islam is to attach any connected other being to God. Hinduism, the focus is on the manifestations, the many manifestations, the self, and the many manifestations of the self. Right? Buddhism, what is God? Who is God? Creation doesn't matter. God doesn't matter. It's all about the escape of suffering. Right? So there's some root similarities. Root similarities in Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism and Jainism, beyond the fact that they all accept, they all have certain rules and standards of life that focus on similar to, basically every human society, that kind of shared humanity and that shared sort of wisdom tradition, the shared idea of temperance, the shared idea of the need for self-control, the shared idea of the lack of satisfaction in the things of the world, and the shared idea of illusion and the one reality in the ultimate. There are these key differences. As we move on, we're going to move into a closer look at the sort of Judeo-Christian understanding, and particularly the Christian understanding as growing out of that Jewish origin. Because on this, it becomes distinctive. And in fact, Nasser will point out some of the distinctiveness here. But the first beginning part is that for the Judeo-Christian understanding, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's this idea of God emptied himself and made something real that wasn't himself. This is essential to both Judaism and Christianity. Creation is a reality. Creation is a reality given its own existence. Now, the goal is that God will be united, but there is this, even in the creation story, there's this sense in which there's 6 days that God creates. That's a metaphorical thing that's going on in the poetry of Genesis 1. But at the end of each of those days, it says the Lord said it was good, except for one of those days, and it's on day 2, and it's that the earth and the heavens are separated. And that's not said to be good. But the objective of the whole story, if you look at the prophets of the Jews, if you look at the continuation of the prophetic thought of the Jewish prophets in its manifestation in the Christian understanding of reality, there's this sense in which God's goal is to bring, in essence, heaven and earth back together. His goal is to bring humans and God into fellowship, into friendship, into unity, but not through the disappearance or destruction of the human and of the created order, but through the further realization of that created order, right? In Hinduism and Buddhism is to escape all the illusions and all the manifestations. In Islam, the illusions and the manifestations don't matter. God is all that matters. But in the Judeo-Christian understanding, God gives actual being to the world and to humans. So within Christianity, this idea of in the beginning God created is continued in the story of Jesus and the Gospel of John. It starts off with in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. All things were made by him, and this Word is the Logos. This is God himself expressed through God's Word, and in the person of Jesus, this incarnation, God takes on flesh and makes it more real than it already was in the Christian sense. So this, what I want to get to is that, Nasser says that Islam is not exclusively a way of love like Christianity, and therefore cannot remain oblivious to any form of knowledge. The way of Islam is essentially Gnostic, focused on knowledge. But notice what he says about Christianity. Christianity is exclusively a way of love. I think this love versus knowledge, and I would argue also love versus power, right? In Islam, if you go up higher, therefore, in nearly every domain of life, the unitary principles of Islam are challenged by secular ideas. The Islamic world is faced with the mortal danger of polytheism or shirk, that is, the setting up of various modern European ideas as gods alongside Allah. As to what will be the outcome of this struggle, he's talking about this struggle with the modern world for Islam. But that struggle is rooted in this idea that there is nothing alongside God, that to put anything, to say that God has a son, anything like that, is to create polytheism, is to fail and fall into idolatry, which is the worst form of sin, is to worship something as God that is not God. But Christianity, at the root, is this idea that the goal of Christians is stated in the idea that we will become like him, like God, because we will see him as he is. So God has made something not himself that is really real and wants to pour himself back into it so that it becomes like him. And in fact, in the Christian vision, this reality is so significant that in the last book of the Christian Bible, the book of Revelation, there's this point at which the Apostle John, who has lived alongside of Jesus on earth and has seen visions of Jesus resurrected in heaven in all his glory, established as king and ruler of all the universe, as the full manifestation of everything that is God. And John turns around and someone's talking to him, and he sees this being that's talking to him, and he starts to bow and worship, thinking it's Jesus. And this one says, "Oh, no, don't worship me. I'm just a servant like you." In other words, from the Christian standpoint, the goal is to become so much like God that a person in their current mortal life, if they saw the sort of final destination of any follower of God in Christ, they would be tempted to worship them because they would be so like God. That is sort of an anathema for Islam. It's also sort of an anathema for Hinduism, because the point of Hinduism is not to make yourself like God. It's to get rid of yourself and recognize that you are God. And those are distinctions, and they're important distinctions. They're important distinctions for the way we think of morality and ethics. And they relate to these questions of power and freedom and love, which we'll look at in another lecture.